Hello everyone. My name is Rebecca, as you all know, as you see on my tag, and I'm the president of the Princeton Open Campus Coalition, which is a student organization that is dedicated to fostering a campus environment free of fear and intolerance by promoting free speech and academic freedom, encouraging civil dialogue, free inquiry, and robust discussions of all matters between Princeton affiliates. For today's discussion, we have two wonderful guest speakers and prominent intellectuals in their field who will be providing their perspectives and insight surrounding the issue of free speech and race. Our first guest, we have Professor Randall Kennedy. He is a Michael R. Klenn Professor of American Law and author at Harvard University. He specializes in areas of contracts, freedom of expression, race relations laws, civil rights legislation, and the Supreme Court. And he is known for taking very different stances on challenging issues, and his views are even controversial among Black intellectuals. He has very notable books such as For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and Law. And he's also a Princeton alum, class of 77. So that's our first guest. Thanks for coming here. Our second guest, we have Professor Glenn Loury, who is a Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. He has published mainly in areas of applied microeconomics theory, game theory, natural resource economics, and the economics of race and inequality. He is a prominent social critic, and his writing mainly focuses on racial inequality and social policy. His most recent work includes, for example, Race, Incarceration, and American Values, and he also hosts the Glenn Loury Show. I highly recommend it. Thank you for being here with us today. So I wanted to start the conversation with this very broad topic of cancel culture, as many of you are very familiar with. And I wanted to get both of your thoughts on it, whether or not, it's like useful, whether it's a hindrance to progress, whether it's a hindrance to our understanding of the grand discussion of race in America and the debate of race in America. So let's start with that. I'll start with Professor Randall Kennedy.
Well, first of all, I can be heard, correct? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for including me in the discussion. I'm interested in the topic in general, but I must say I'm particularly interested in this discussion being rooted in Princeton. I have very close, long-standing affiliations with Princeton. My older brother went to Princeton. My younger sister went to Princeton. I went to Princeton. I have a daughter at Princeton now. She's a senior. I have two nieces and a nephew who went to Princeton. So, Princeton has been very important in the development of my immediate family. So what happens at Princeton matters tremendously to me. Now, on your question about cancel culture, I've been, I'll tell you, for a long while, actually, I have to confess that I was not as attentive to the problem of truncated discussion on campus, not just at Princeton, but just in general. I mean, I was very aware of various controversies that would arise, but I would tell my friends at various places that, well, there are a lot of universities in the United States. We're talking about a lot of young people. Things will happen. Don't make mountains out of molehills. Basically, chill. I was constantly telling my friends at the organization FIRE and other places that I thought that they were really just, that they were going way overboard in their anxiety. And in the last couple of years, however, I've come to think that I was being complacent, that I was wrong. Clearly, there is a very big problem when at leading universities you have some of the things that are happening Princeton, Stanford, all over the place. And so I think that you're, Rebecca, I'm happy that you and your colleagues are banding together to discuss and shine a light on problems of undue restriction of discussion on our campuses about race and other things. With respect to cancel culture, like so many terms that get popular, cancel culture can mean a variety of different things to people. And I think we have to wrestle with that. I don't think there's anything, sometimes I hear people talk about cancel culture and then I ask them, well, what do you mean? And what they basically say is, well, I said something and somebody else said that they really didn't like it and they called me racist. Well, I mean, or they removed me from their, their social, their platform, or they're not talking to me. I mean, what I say in response is, well, political contestation about issues that touch people very differently, it's going to cause, there's going to be heat. There is going to be anger. And sometimes people are going to respond by saying all sorts of things. There is racism in the United States. So, I mean, sometimes when somebody says, what you just said is a racist statement, sometimes I think that, yeah, I agree. And so, sometimes I disagree, but you can't, just because somebody says that, a statement is racist, people should have the ability to make their statements. There's a political contest, and in a political contest, there's going to be pushing and shoving and a certain amount of hurt feelings. And I think that has to be accepted. I think, you set forth your argument, they set forth their argument, there's an audience, people are going to make up their minds. I don't think that we can demand that everybody, sort of be quiet and don't say things that are going to hurt our feelings. No, if you get into certain issues, voices are going to be raised, there is going to be heat, there is going to be hurt feelings. So that's number one. Number two, I'd say then we have to determine, well, what goes over the line? At what point does contestation turn into illicit censorship? And we can talk about that. Certainly if a professor is being told that they stand in jeopardy if they pursue certain subjects, if they pursue certain ideas, if they write certain things, then I think we have entered into a place where now we're talking about censorship or reasonable fear of censorship. And it seems to me that that should be just off the table. But otherwise, we have a political contest and people have to be tough and be thick-skinned and set forth whatever they want to set forth. I think I've said enough for now. Love to hear what my colleague Glenn Loury has to say.
You haven't said nearly enough, Randall. Okay, so I don't know Princeton. I don't have any personal connection. I do know Brown. I've been teaching here for a while. In 2014, I think it was, the police commissioner of the city of New York, invited to give a speech at Brown, was precluded from being able to deliver his address. He was purportedly a racist cop because he presided over a controversial policy called stop and frisk in New York City. He was coming to the campus to defend that policy. He wasn't permitted to speak. He was shouted down. 2 committees of the faculty were impaneled to reflect upon this event. And they produced a report. And the argument of the report, I summarize drastically, was that the imperative of an open discussion of a controversial and arguable set of questions was overridden by the threat which this officer of the city of New York posed to the tranquility and the peace of mind of students, because he represented something that they found to be reprehensible. He was not permitted to speak. Now, I don't want to beat a dead horse. It's been quite some time now, but that's a extinction level event in a university. The people who did it were thugs, commandeering the podium for politics. It was a political takeover of the functionality of the university. That's a fire. That's a first alarm. That's going for the jugular. That's going for the raison d'etre of the institution. I'm not talking about somebody not inviting me to a dinner party. I'm talking about somebody seizing the podium and preventing deliberation. Among the student activists who fomented this crime against what we do in the university was someone who was awarded a prize by my colleagues for leadership. That's losing our way. That's failing to appreciate how precious and fragile is the institutional environment which nurtures what we do. This is not about left-wing or right-wing politics. This is about preserving a civilizational accomplishment, which is the creation of the space in these universities for open deliberation. Let me fast forward to 2020. George Floyd gets killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And letters spring forth from administrators of educational institutions, not parsing the very difficult and subtle moral and political issues confronting us in the wake of not only that event, but the protest and rioting that occurred after it. Not deliberating, not analyzing, not appreciating the difficulty of the issues that were at stake. To wit, was it a racial incident? What validity do I have for the inference that it was a racial incident? What do I know about the motives of the people who were involved in the incident? It was assimilated to the killing of Emmett Till in the 1950s. It was said to be a harbinger or an emblem or an instantiation of an age-old American disease. Silly things were said by people administering serious institutions to placate a mob. They abdicated our responsibility to think it through. That's what we're there for. We're there to think it through. They simply jumped on a bandwagon. They've been doing so ever since. So, I'm not here to tell horror stories or to complain about personal affronts. I'm not. I'm here to sound an alarm about the integrity of our overall enterprise. The barbarians are at the gates.
Thank you for both of your comments. Yeah, that was very insightful, and I definitely agree with most of what you said. That kind of leads into, the whole, I think one of the recent controversies that happened with relation to Princeton was the whole debate surrounding the removal of Woodrow Wilson's name from now the School of Public and International Affairs And another thing that has come to my attention in like recent months was the 1619 project. And so there's this whole push of, you know, like ever since the George Floyd incident, there's been this whole rise and this whole push of rethinking history and revisionism history and rethinking like how race is like intertwined in the United States. And I kind of like wanted to start with these two questions. And I wanted to get your insights on them. So first, I want to ask, what impact has language had on society and the discussion of race? And I'll start with Professor Randall Kennedy.
Well, couple things. You began with, you mentioned the struggle over Woodrow Wilson, and then you asked another question, but let me pick up on your comment about the struggle over Woodrow Wilson. I could live with a decision going either way. I could have lived with Woodrow Wilson's name remaining, you know, a salient name at Princeton University. I mentioned my brother. My brother went to the Woodrow he went to the Woodrow Wilson School. I used to mind the library at the Woodrow Wilson School. One of my favorite professors at Princeton was Arthur Link, Woodrow Wilson's biographer, the editor of the Woodrow Wilson papers. I was quite aware of Woodrow Wilson's, you know, career and racial views the whole time I was at Princeton University. And no, it did not make me feel, you know, diminished, bad at all. You know, I've talked with people, I see Woodrow Wilson, and, you know, frankly, I get a little bit of a kick out of looking at Woodrow Wilson's portrait and saying, you know, well, President Wilson, you didn't think I'd be here, did you? But I am. So it didn't bother me, to tell you the truth. And so, you know, I would have been okay with Woodrow Wilson's name staying up there. But by the way, though, I'm also okay with Woodrow Wilson's name being removed. There's an argument that way. I think there's a good argument for removing it. My view, you had two contending views. You had an argument. One prevailed. I don't see that, frankly, as being a problem involving, you know, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. People expressed themselves and a decision was made. So with respect to the Woodrow Wilson thing, that's my view. On the question of language, of course, language is, you know, very important and, you know, comes up all the time with respect to the issues we're discussing. It certainly has come up at Princeton. I must say, I was disheartened, and I thought it was an absolute embarrassment for Princeton University a couple of years ago, that episode where you had the teacher who was teaching a course on, of all things, taboo. My understanding is he was an anthropologist teaching about taboo. What is taboo? How does that happen? What does taboo mean? How are certain things, how do they become taboo? And in such a course, on the very first day, he mentions a tabooed word, the infamous N-word. I wrote a book about the infamous N-word. Name of the book, Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word. He mentions this word. Students get up and get all hot and, you know, how could you possibly mention this word? They leave. Then there's a bunch of controversy about it, and he ended up canceling the class. Now, I think that episode was an embarrassment, but I think it was an embarrassment that went in a lot of different directions. I think it was an embarrassment for the students I mean, I would have had a different view maybe if we were talking about 5th grade students. I would be a little bit, I would have a little bit more sympathy. We weren't talking about 5th grade students. We were talking about students at Princeton University taking a class on tabooed expression. And now you're going to get up and you're going to, I'm insulted. Insulted? Why? Why are you in such a class? The teacher, this teacher wasn't on the street calling you this. This teacher, you're in the classroom talking about tabooed expression. Why? It seems to me completely unreasonable that you would even have the feeling of being insulted. So I was very down on the students, but I must say, I was also down on the professor. And here I'll get back to my original comments. The professor canceled the class. It seemed to me that that was very improper thing to do. It seemed to me that the proper thing to have done would have been to have maybe had a class. Teacher says, I understand that there are a number of members of the class who are upset. I will, you've got some minutes, you've got 10, 15 minutes to tell everybody why you were upset. And then I'm going to respond, and then we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to move on. The idea, however, of canceling the class, it seemed to me that that was a very bad thing. And like I said, that I feel tremendous fondness and tremendous admiration in general for Princeton, but that was an episode that I thought was a dark episode at the university. Again, I think I've said enough. Professor Loury.
I don't really have anything to add to that. I have no stake in the Woodrow Wilson debate. I'm reminded of the incident when the University of Chicago legal scholar Jeffrey Stone came to Brown to give a lecture, and he was telling a story about a professor using, I think it was the N-word actually, in a lecture and getting reprimanded and so on. And then someone in our audience, as he was recounting the story, African-American woman, a student, stood to reprimand Jeffrey Stone for bracketing. It was I'm telling a story about someone who was telling a story about something, and the N-word came up. And his response to her was, I told you what I was doing. I'm not insulting anybody. I mean, it's a word. It's in quotation marks, if you like. And you don't get to tell me what words to use. That was a moment of courage. I mean, you say, Randall, people have no right to complain if their views are unpopular. They should just take it. I suppose take it or shut up. If they can't take it, they should shut up. So your professor, who you think fell short, couldn't take it. He decided to shut up.
Yeah, I don't think that was too bad. By the way, Glenn, I should let you know that there is a new chapter. I know Jeff Stone and deeply respect Jeff Stone. I should let you know, though, that he has changed. About 2 years ago, so he's a great First Amendment scholar.
Yeah.
And in his course on the First Amendment, when he's teaching the fighting words doctrine, every year he would have this, a routine in which he would enunciate the term nigger. And about 2 years ago, a group of students, the University of Chicago Black Students Association, University of Chicago Law School's Black Students Association, really took up arms against that and prevailed upon him. They had a meeting, and he, in light of their action, has changed. He no longer enunciates the word. Now, I know him, and I wrote him because I read about the controversy, and I expressed sympathy. And then he changed, and I wrote him, and I said, I understand, I respect you, and I understand, teachers have to make pedagogical decisions. How, where are you gonna, how much investment do you want to do on this as opposed to this? And I told him I disagreed with the position ultimately that he took. I don't hold it against him. I respect him. But this has come up in, in my neck of the woods, in law schools. There are now a whole bunch of these cases where somebody will be reading from an opinion, and this word or some other word like it will come up, and the teacher will be raked over the coals for reading the word in an opinion. And again, this is one of the things that has actually changed my mind. It's one of the things that has made me much more concerned with this subject. I simply don't get it. It seems
Let
to
me ask you a
me,
question. You wrote
yeah,
the book on the N-word.
yeah.
How can it be a fighting word when all I have to do is go to Sirius XM and tune to my hip hop channel? I can hear it a dozen times before I can drink my cup of coffee.
Well, I hear you, and that would be
No,
an
it's a
argument.
serious question. How can it be a fighting word when it's in common usage? You
Well,
can't possibly be telling me that the identity of the speaker is such as to engender a prohibitive exclusion for the legitimacy of using a word. You can't be telling me that, because I can't be the Randall Kennedy that I used to know.
No. Listen, don't get me wrong. Don't fight with me. I'm just telling, I don't, first of all, just as a matter of law, there is a big controversy over the status of the fighting words doctrine. There are many people who think that actually that doctrine is itself wrong, that there ought not be a fighting words doctrine. And I tend to agree with that. The fighting words doctrine, after all, stemmed from an episode. The origins was an episode in which a person called a police officer a fascist. And the police officer said he was, highly insulted. Well, what, a police officer? They're supposed, they should be trained in such a way that they're immune to this sort of thing. But in any event, I don't even like the fighting words doctrine, period. And I would agree with you. Another thing that's a problem on campuses, and it often arises when people are discussing the infamous N-word, has to do with who can say what. So that you have people who say, well, it's one thing if Jay-Z says it. It's one thing if Lil Wayne says it. It's one thing if 50 Cent says it. But then if, John Q, white person says it, that's different. And people ask me all the time, what do I think about that? And my view is, are you kidding? In the realm of culture, we should not have racial offenses. It should not be the case that I'm privileged to say something that my colleague Cass Sunstein can't say. That's no good. I'm totally against that. But of course, that has made inroads. I saw that there was some controversy involving a documentary filmmaker who makes a film about some subject, and people are criticizing the documentary filmmaker because that filmmaker is not part of the group that is the subject of the film. These are the sorts of things that are, leaching into our culture, even at the high, in our university culture, and it's bad.
Can I make another observation? This is about words and about the policing of them. And the concern I have is that genuine moral argument necessary to deal with, awful situations of conflict and disagreement gets crowded out by the superficial conventions of policing what it is that people say and how they say it. We fight about this ephemera. We fight about, I take offense at the fact that you use a word, not about actual arguments, in which there would be serious moral engagement. I could give many examples. Violence in American cities now, okay? Homicide, murder, so-called black on black crime. It seems to me that it is a really profound moral dilemma for the society. we don't really get up close to it. I mean, I don't hear, I'm just wondering what the funeral is like for an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old who's in a little tiny casket because he's or she hasn't yet grown up, who's been killed by a stray bullet somewhere in Black urban America yesterday. It's a Pentecostal church on a busy strip mall thoroughfare with people banging tambourines inside and wailing and moaning out their sorrow. This is happening scores, hundreds of times in America as we speak. It's a first order moral problem. We don't talk about it at all. And yet, if you were caught criticizing Black Lives Matter somewhere on a university campus, maybe even on yours or mine, Randall, you'd be hung out to dry for creating a hostile climate for your students by challenging them to think about what's really at stake when they talk about the valuation of Black life.
You don't have it. I mean, you know, again, we need to be careful here about, I don't want to have just preaching to the choir. The fact, I totally agree with you on that. In fact, it's even worse than you suggest. I mean, in some places, the very term, you know, Black on Black crime is viewed as, you know, objectionable, and, you know, in some places might warrant you know, a letter to the dean of your department. The term, you know, I mean, there is a very deep problem. I use the term, for instance, in my work, in my writing, and in my speech, I very often use the term Negro. And I've, you know, there are people, I've gotten protests about that, and it hasn't affected me in a deep way. And frankly, I hope it doesn't. It's not like I'm, you know, looking for martyrdom or anything. But it is a problem there. You know, this sort of people's, you know, standing on tippy toe to be offended. And, you know, there's some students who've asked me about it, and I tell them, you know, to tell you the truth, I give them a story. I say, listen, I didn't actually used to use the word Negro. I started using the word Negro. I can tell you when I started using it a lot. I started using it a lot in 1983, 84. And the reason why I know that with such particularity is because I started using it a lot when I was a law clerk for Mr. Civil Rights, Thurgood Marshall. The first memo that I gave to Thurgood Marshall used the, you know, word African American, and he circled it and said, listen, I use the word Negro, capital N. I use it for the year. And frankly, ever since then, I use it, you know, partly because I don't want word echo. I don't want to just use the same terms over and over again. But partly also I use it as, you know, I revere Mr. Civil Rights, and it makes, frankly, it's sort of sentimental. I use it, and it sort of reminds me of him. That this would be viewed as, you know, I mean, all these terms, I mean, this would be viewed as some sort of, I don't know, an indictment, if this would be viewed as, you know, lack of sensitivity, as this would be viewed as the way that some people view it. I agree. It's really too bad. We've got some very important things to talk about, and those are the things that we ought to be talking about.
Well, perhaps then you will agree with me that acts of transgression are the imperative response of people like ourselves to these creeping encroachments, that it's really important to defy the word police so as not to allow their authority to be taken presumptively for granted.
I agree. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why I'm on this call right now. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really happy to hear about what students are doing There are a few students that are on the, you know, I want to say, by the way, in this whole issue, students actually are important actors, and I would like to hear from students a lot more. I think that students can play a tremendous role in this. I mean, basically what's going on, I mean, we're basically engaged in a struggle for public opinion. And I think that when students, come out with, some of these actions where, certain, we can't debate such and such, we can't debate such and such. Well, students who are members of a class, people who are in a university or college, that should trigger a letter, a petition, a letter in the student newspaper. We, the undersigned, we have all sorts of different views, but no, we're not going to stand for this. This is ridiculous. And I think that students should be raising their voices a lot more than they have been. And I think actually that faculty members should, facilitate that. I think that there should be a lot more raising of voices because this stuff does come up. I was really surprised this past summer. Again, the Princeton ultimatum letter. I mean, that letter, there was lots of things with the letter. There was a hubbub at Princeton about various things. There were a whole lot of faculty letters. Well, the one at Princeton included a provision. One of the demands was some sort of committee that would oversee faculty teaching, faculty publication, to monitor, racism. And I mean, I remember, it was one of these things where you're reading sort of late at night and you think, you read something and you're sort of sleepy and you think, oh no, no, I didn't read that right. And you sort of go back and reread it, and then you reread it and you say, oh my gosh, are you kidding? And this was for real. And then I had the feeling, well, you know how these letters are, people sort of sign them. If this is brought to people, people's attention, people will quietly back away. When it was brought up, there were a number of members of the faculty who doubled down and said, oh no, we realized that this was there, and they embraced it and defended it. Well, this is a problem. And I think that you're absolutely right. It has to be addressed. I think it has to be addressed very forthrightly. And, I think that's part of the work in the coming, months and years ahead.
I do want to take a pause. I just received that there are 2 questions. I think Professor Randall Kennedy had a question, and then I'll go to Professor Robert George.
Yeah, I'm Professor Kelly. I'm actually Professor Tom Kelly. I'm signed in under my 10-year-old daughter. She uses my computer. So first, I just want to say thanks, especially to Professors Loury and Kennedy, and also to the Princeton Open Campus Coalition for organizing this. This is fantastic. I just wanted to pick up on something that went by a bit quickly. Seems like of just local interest, the Woodrow Wilson controversy. Because my own thoughts about this, I was interested, I very much shared, I think Professor Kennedy said that, look, I'm not deeply invested in this one way or the other. I could see a reasonable case for changing the name. I could see a reasonable case for keeping it, or at least, it's not. And I think Professor Loury similarly said, I don't have any dog in this fight or something to that effect. I feel very much the same way. If anything, I mean, look, I'm probably one of the more conservative, I've been a professor here for 15 years. I'm probably one of the most conservative people, certainly in the humanities here at Princeton. Look, I have no brief for Woodrow Wilson. I knew about his racism the whole time. If anything, I don't think he was that great a president of the United States. So that's a whole different article. So it was striking to me how the administration, for example, went 180 degrees on this. The first 6-7 years I was a professor here, nothing negative was ever said about Woodrow Wilson. And he was venerated. I'm in the philosophy department. when Woodrow Wilson was president, his office was in the building that now houses the philosophy department. Every day I'd go to my office, the campus tour guide would come back, and most of the discussion about where the philosophy department and religion are housed would be about how great Woodrow Wilson was. Here's where his office is. Went 180 degrees the other way, suddenly it's all negative, all bad. I share your judgment for that case, but in this case and many other cases, when it's, this general down south, something's named after him, on the merits, I'm happy to take his name off. I get that compelling case. The thing that gives me pause, and maybe this isn't such an interesting phenomenon because it's just a special case of the general slippery slope type worry, is I see that although on the merits of the case, I'm happy to have the name come off, the people who are hell-bent, where they get up first thing in the morning, this is the most important thing they're working on, is getting this person's name taken off. I see where this is heading. And I think if they're successful at this, then they're going to come after somebody I find much less objectionable. And we've already seen even these bizarre cases where not just Confederate monuments to Confederate generals, but some monuments to Union generals have been pulled down, right? And if we really start judging people, Abraham Lincoln, right, was a racist by our standards. Most of the abolitionists were racist by our standards, right? Even people who, and it would be kind of, so I'm just wondering how you'd recommend thinking about these cases. Should we just be thinking about, okay, here's, my middle school child's, they just changed the name, the John Witherspoon Middle School. That was just, they removed John Witherspoon's name off that. Should we just think about the particular case? Or should we think about it in the context of, look, here's what's going on in this country, and it strengthens a certain, it moves things along a further trajectory. How do you think about that kind of consideration?
The subject is really deeply interesting to me. The person who really got me onto this subject was a person that I met at Princeton. He was one of my favorite teachers. His name is Sanford Levinson. He's now a professor at the University of Texas Law School. And Sandy Levinson wrote a book, I think about 20 years ago, on monuments and all of the sort of the argumentation around monuments. And I think it's a fascinating subject. My own view has changed over time. Now I'm concerned along with you. Again, I think it's basically a political question, and that there are a variety of reasonable destinations. And I think that the way people should talk about it is, let's talk about it and let's be straightforward about it. You mentioned Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as far as I'm concerned, was a perfectly great person. I just ordered a T-shirt with Abraham Lincoln's, with an Abraham Lincoln photograph on it. But Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, well, what about the Native Americans? The Union Army during Reconstruction went west and decimated the American Indians. I mean, so what am I to do with Abraham Lincoln? I want to know about Lincoln, and I abhor, some of what Lincoln did, but do I want all of the statutes taken down with respect to Abraham Lincoln? No, I do not. And by the way, George Washington, there's a columnist I like. Glenn, I bet you don't like him, but I like him. The columnist for the New York Times.
Charles Blow.
Blow had a column.
You're right.
Blow had a column on. I like Charles Blow. I mean, ideologically, we're sympathetic. I like Charles Blow generally, but Charles Blow had this article, a column on George Washington, and I think it was sort of titled something like "Even George Washington," and his basic thing was, even George Washington, take down everything. I mean, he was a slave owner. Do I feel that? No, I don't feel that. As far as I'm concerned, that's right. George Washington was a slave owner, and let's be real about it. Like I said, let's really get down and be real. In George Washington's mouth, he had dentures that came from the teeth of slaves. So I mean that let's be very vivid. Let's understand what we're dealing with. I understand the horror, the terror, the cruelty of slavery. Okay, I understand that. George Washington, as far as I'm concerned, hell of a fella. George Washington, stepped down from power. I certainly wish it was the case that in a lot of nation states around the world that they had had their George Washington. I certainly wish that, after World War II, in many of the decolonizing new nation states, that they had had their George Washington.
Randall,
Now,
excuse me for interrupting. I think I get it. I get it, man. You have been reduced to defending George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. I want you to think about that for a minute.
Reduce, what do you mean?
What I mean is the barbarians no longer at the gates, having overrun the gates and approached the citadel. This is the United States of America that we're talking about. This is our national narrative. It comes under assault by some spoiled, petulant, adolescent, sophomoric know-nothings.
Not all, but go on.
Well, I know, I am exaggerating for effect, okay? Because George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, if we can't agree on that, we don't have a country here. All right, I'm not going to split the difference with them. I understand that slavery was horrific. I also know that the Civil War was horrific. I know that emancipation of slaves en masse is a virtually unprecedented historical achievement that happened here in the United States of America because of people like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. I'm saying you have to meet these people directly. They are committing logical errors of anachronism. They project backwards a sensibility that exists only because of the historical events as a lens to judge the historical time. Abraham Lincoln didn't have the benefit of a century and a half of history to reflect on the meaning of Abraham Lincoln. To judge him as Ava DuVernay does, why don't we name names here? There's a film out there by a celebrated, iconic American cultural artist. I'm talking about the filmmaker Ava DuVernay, that says that the 13th Amendment is a fraud. It didn't actually emancipate the slave because it has a clause in it that allows for the possibility of the involuntary detention of people who have broken criminal laws. That kind of nonsense is what finally culminates in mobs attacking Ulysses S. Grant statues. Okay, so that's what I mean by saying you've been reduced to defending Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, and it's a pathetic thing to behold. With respect,
I will go. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington. It goes further. It goes further. So, one thing I've said in these debates about naming is, one of the things I think is sort of interesting about the debates. I've said this on a bunch of times, but it hasn't gotten much traction, to my disappointment. In the debate about monuments, it's always white people who are the subjects. And I've said, since we're talking about, the sort of, our modern age and bringing marginalized people to the center, let's bring some marginalized people to the center. So let's talk about, Malcolm X. Now, when I was a kid and growing up in Washington, D.C., many marches started at Malcolm X Park, downtown, 16th Street. I think there's lots to admire about Malcolm X. There's lots to be critical of, and I'm very critical of many things about Malcolm X, but there's also much to admire. One thing about Malcolm X is that Malcolm X, for much of his adult life, and the part of his life that, made him a historical figure as a minister in the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X believed that white people were quite literally devils. Quite literally. I'm not talking metaphorically here. I'm literally devils. Now, at the end of his life, near the end of his life, he abandoned that belief. But for much of his life, he believed that. Question: where should we stand with respect to high schools, colleges, parks, stamps, other, you know, monuments named after Malcolm X? I abhor Malcolm X's racist beliefs vis-a-vis, you know, white people as devils. Do I want to keep the monuments to Malcolm X? The answer is yes. Let me add one more. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was one of the greats of the Second Reconstruction. He was the person who invited Martin Luther King Jr. to come to Birmingham in the winter and spring of 1963. Fred Shuttlesworth, the United States reports and the Fed seconds are full of cases where Fred Shuttlesworth was a civil rights movement in and of himself. In the last 10 years of Fred Shuttlesworth's life, he spent much of his time campaigning against gay liberation, LGBT. He campaigned against ordinances. This was a big deal with him. Now, I have a very different view. I abhor Fred Shuttlesworth's views on that issue. I do. You fly into the Birmingham International Airport. Where do you fly? You fly into the Birmingham Fred Shuttlesworth International Airport. Do I want that airport to be renamed in as much as Fred Shuttlesworth was, you know, anti-gay? I have gay friends, deep friends, and have participated in, have participated in, gay liberation, this, that, and the other. Do I want that airport renamed? No, I do not. So, what do we have here? Life's really complicated. History is really messy.
Let me mention another factor.
Yeah.
We're not all on the same page about what's worth honoring and what's not worth honoring. So that when we change the name on a building or we take down a statue, we well may be offending some of our fellow citizens. And we're not resolving the dispute between ourselves. We're not actually having a deliberation about it. For example, to what extent should a Southerner take regional pride in the struggle of his forebears or her forebears against the war of aggression of the Union Army? To what extent? Any? Must they be apologetic about that regional impulse? I don't have an answer here. I'm not trying to declare anything. I'm trying to describe a problem or a question. Doesn't there, in the interest of the comedy and the maintenance of the possibility of our democratic experiment together, require of us some degree of forbearance with respect to policing this kind of sentiment? I remember John McCain saying I think it was a presidential campaign of 2000 when he was running for the nomination against George W. Bush, in the context of, I think it was the South Carolina primary, where there was a debate about the Confederate flag, that some of his forebears had served in the Confederacy and it was okay to honor them. And I wrote a piece in the New York Times actually attacking Senator McCain, saying that those forebears were rebels against the Union, and there was nothing honorable about what they were doing, et cetera, et cetera. And I after I thought about it for a while, I came to regret that, because I think it's just a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder than that. The hero worship that some African Americans attach to the legacy of you were mentioning Malcolm X. I don't know. I'll stop before I get myself into trouble, and I don't know exactly what I want to say. But some of that sentiment on behalf of a warm memory about the South and the sufferings and the depredations that they had to endure and whatnot, I'm loath to just kind of peremptorily dismiss them with the back of my hand. I don't know. Tell me where I'm wrong, Randall.
I'm not going to tell you where you're wrong. What I'm going to say is, again, let's get back to what brings us together here.
Yeah.
And what should happen on a university campus. And it seems to me that what should happen on a university campus is that people should say what's on their mind. And also, by the way, be able to say 30 minutes later, in light of what I've heard, in light of what colleagues have said, I've changed a little bit. I mean, it shouldn't be, I'm frozen in time, I make a statement, and then that's it. I mean, education, it's part of a flowing thing. I'm sure, frankly, I'm quite sure that tomorrow morning, when I wake up, I'll probably, replay this discussion, and I will probably say, well, gosh, I wish I hadn't said such and such. I mean, but that's what you're in class.
I already feel that way, Randy.
Okay, well, I mean, frankly, that is what we should protect. That is what should be protected. It should be the case that somebody, at this moment, I'm trying to do the best that I can. Somebody, Ms. Adams asked me a question. I try to do the best I can in answering the question. Other people say this, say that. I do a little bit more reading. I do a little bit more thinking. In a week's time, maybe I'll answer the same way. Maybe I won't. We're trying to, what is education about? We're trying to get self-clarification. And I guess, what's a problem is a certain sort of thinking which suggests that, well, we don't really need to struggle with self-clarification. I've got the answers. And if you don't have the answer, how can you possibly think that? That, it seems to me, we should sort of, knock it off. What do you mean, how can I possibly think it? I possibly think it because I just said it. And, here's my argument. What's your argument? And I think that you're right, Glenn, that, the university is a very precious place. And, we've seen in the past few years how norms, things you don't even think about. Don't even think about them. You don't think about them until something happens. And then you say, oh my gosh. And I think that that's what's happening now. We're in classes. People, I can't say this. What do you mean you can't say it? No, I can't say this. This is a real problem, and it's going to take real work. I don't have all the answers about what to do. One thing I do think that people should insist upon speaking, stating their position, and also insisting that they can, I'm saying what I think. I'm also going to insist that I be allowed a certain amount of provisionality in my thinking. I can be wrong, and I should be allowed to, frankly, be wrong. What's wrong with that? I'm wrong. And, maybe in light of other information, maybe in light of other views, I will change my mind and, reach a higher level. But it seems to me that there should be some sort of more willingness to just listen to one another, more willingness to accept error, accept mistake. That's part of learning. And I think we should accept that.
I think Professor George had a question. He's been waiting for some time, so yeah.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. But if a student has a question, let me yield my place in line to a student, because I want to make sure students have an opportunity to engage with Professors Kennedy and Loury. Or is there a student waiting to ask a question? If there's not, I'll go ahead.
Yep, you could go.
Okay, good. First, Glenn and Randy, thank you so much, not only for being with us today, but for modeling candor, what the Greeks called parrhesia, plain speech, and engaging with each other and not being afraid to engage with each other in a robust way and to challenge each other. It's just so refreshing and such a great example for our students and really for all of us. So thank you for that. I also want to underline something that Randy Kennedy said about the importance of students. Students have a really critically important role to play. But Randy said something, Professor Kennedy said something else that's really important, and that is faculty have to back the students, have to support the students, stand in solidarity with the students who are willing to play that role, who are willing to stand up against the groupthink and the orthodoxy and ask questions and demand that the university be faithful to its core values, including the values of freedom of thought and speech. And I'm so proud of the Princeton Open Campus Coalition on this score. We've had some great victories for free speech and other core academic values here at Princeton. And in all of those, our students have had a role. You go back a number of years and students have had a very important role. It's been students, it's been faculty, and it's been alumni together. Even when it came to enacting the University of Chicago free speech principles, which we were the second university after Chicago to do and the first to do it by way of a faculty vote. That was the combined effort, really, led by faculty, of course, but student support was important. Alumni support has been important, and student and alumni support have been important to maintaining those principles. So I want students to get that message that Professor Kennedy is sending you. It's just really critically important. I'd love to see Princeton Open Campus Coalition type organizations on university campuses around the country. And the great thing about them is they're not just provocateurs. They're not just people who hold, bake sales where you sell people of one race a cookie for 50 cents and people for another race a dollar. No, what they do is they actually engage the issues in an intellectually serious way. And that's just so wonderful. And the faculty really has to stand behind that. Going now to the substance of the matters that Professors Loury and Kennedy have been talking about. A question I have has to do with academic administrators. There have been a few around the country who have distinguished themselves in the face of the cancel culture, in the face of the cancel mobs, the outrage mobs that have formed and gone after faculty or students or administrators who have stepped out of line by violating whatever the police, the speech and thought police are policing today. But they have been very few, very few. In most cases, what do we see from our academic administrators? Cowardice. And I want to know why that's the case, and I want to know what can be done about it. This much I do know. When cowards face pressure, they yield to the pressure. If the pressure is only coming from one side, they'll yield to it. And that's how the outrage mobs get their way. That's how people get canceled. When you have cowards who are in charge, they've got to be feeling pressure from the other direction if they're going to stand up straight. But so often they don't. And so I think the real question before those of us who want to do something about it is, how do we find ways to apply the counter pressure? And now a final point that changes the subject just a little. It's on the substance of free speech and what it's for. And Professor Kennedy touched on this in his most recent set of remarks. It's not just an abstract right. The right to free speech, especially on university campuses, is not just an abstract right. There's a purpose to it. And that purpose is to serve the university's mission of truth seeking. It's the way we as individual scholars and students pursue our vocation as truth seekers. And that means that we've got to understand the defense of free speech as part of a larger project, a collaborative project that we're all engaged in together, of trying to get at the truth of things. One mistake I hope people will not fall into is to think of free speech as a kind of abstract right of some people who happen to be deviant, happen to be outliers, to dissent and express dissent from elite opinion, which is the dominant opinion, which becomes the groupthink in elite institutions. And I consider all universities to be elite institutions because it's mean to people to deprive them of their free speech rights. I think that's a misunderstanding. The first thing we have to understand is Elite opinion should not be considered as normative. Elite opinion has been wrong, very badly wrong in the past. Take the case of eugenics. The whole establishment, the academic establishment was behind it. The great philanthropic trusts were behind it. The great institutions of society, government, the economy, all behind it 100%. People who were against it were considered hicks and rubes. They were the outliers. They were the backward people. The Catholic Church, a few evangelical preachers, they were considered hicks because they didn't get along. And by the way, you go to any university campus, including this one here at Princeton, you're going to find monuments to people who were up to their necks in eugenic ideology. We don't think about that anymore, but it's a reminder of how dominant elite opinion can be wrong. And you need freedom of speech by those dissenters, not just to be nice to them and let them be wrong, but in order for them to question what in fact might be wrong, because there's no guarantee at all that elite opinion is correct opinion. So puncturing the groupthink is an important role that free speech plays, and that people who are willing to exercise their right to free speech play in the truth-seeking mission of the university. End of sermon.
Well said.
I have been disappointed too by some of our academic administrators, and to tell you the truth, I don't, that's a part of the. I don't know why. I have been surprised at some of what I've seen and heard, the sort of the formulaic public relations letters. And, I don't have a good diagnosis. I'm not altogether sure about what is prompting that. On the question of what should be done, I don't know all that should be done, but one thing that I think that should be done is that people in our communities need to say what's on their minds, so that, when one of these statements is made, or hey, I'm here, don't play, I'm not a dope. I agree with this and this, but I don't agree with this and this and this. I think that people are going to have to, speak up. And I agree with you too, that when people do speak up, quite often, a letter to the editor, and I don't care if it's the letter to the editor of the New York Times, or if it's a letter to the editor of the Daily Princetonian, letters to the editor, make a difference. And I think that people are just going to have to write letters. They're going to have to make their positions known. And I think that, is that going to be enough? I don't know if it's going to be enough, but I think I have seen that make a difference. And I would urge people to weigh in. And again, I would emphasize, just piggybacking on, Professor George's, students, your voices make a difference too. Not only when you're alums, yes, when you're alums, it makes a difference, but while you're in school. Because when you're in school, we need to remember that there is an audience. There are a lot of people in these various controversies. You have the people that are saying one thing, and then you have the people who are saying another thing. There are a whole lot of people who are watching. And they're taking their cues from various people. And so I think that when you're a student and you write a letter to the editor, well, your neighbor in the room next door might not be saying anything to you, but they're reading that letter. And I think that they're taking their cue. And I think that matters a whole lot. Or at least it can.
Well, I just add one thing about administrators is career concerns. A person in that position has to worry that their reputation will be besmirched if they stand up against the zeitgeist, and then their future employment possibilities might be in. I mean, I don't know that I'm all for heroism, but I don't know that it's a policy. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Individuals should stand up. Sure, we should have character. I'm for that, but I don't know if it's a policy. And you know, we don't talk about who are the trustees and how the institution manages its affairs, and I don't know that we're going to get to the root of the matter.
Well, one thing, Glenn, I'll say about that, I know heroism isn't a policy, but our young people, the people that Randy and I are talking about who have such an important role to play, our students, they need and they deserve to see grown-ups exercise some courage. And, you know, here, at the risk of embarrassing you, I mean, what an example you set by your own willingness to challenge these orthodoxies on your own campus and beyond, and to speak out so boldly. I know that's not a policy, but that heroism, if you'll permit me to say it, that willingness to take the slings and arrows that come when you question the zeitgeist, is something that's a great encouragement to young people. It's hard for young people. It's hard for all of us, but it's really hard for young people to stand up against groupthink. It's really hard. It's really hard. Kids go crazy if they think they're wearing the wrong tennis shoes. People deceive themselves with the belief that young people are natural rebels. They're not natural rebels at all. They're the opposite. They're the conformists. If they think they've got the wrong Nikes, it's the end of the world. They need to see grown-ups doing what you're doing what Randy's doing, you know, doing what the folks at Heterodox Academy and FIRE are doing. I mean, they see enough of the other sort, of the cowards who just go along.
I think Professor Hakel had a question, and now I'll move on to Professor Lundragan.
Thanks. Thank you. I'd like to thank you both. I'm a great admirer, have been a great admirer of both your work and your courage, and I applaud you. And I also want to thank Rebecca and the POCC for organizing this. So I'm interested in actually the effective ways in which this can be fought. There are some people on this call, some colleagues of mine, who I know think that the war is lost. It's over. Simply the numbers are too great. There are too many administrators already whose very business is to enforce a particular ideology. I'm interested in hearing from you what you think can be done through the law, maybe through systems, through structures, to fight this. Because to me, it seems there are at least two serious weaknesses to the social justice group. One is that it's advocating racism. It's fighting racism with racism, and that's illegal in this country. And the second is that, you know, they're attacking fundamental constitutional principles of this country, the First Amendment, academic freedom. So I think that they have Achilles' heels, not just one. And I would like to hear what you think can be done to effectively fight them.
I'm a law professor. I make my, you know, I pay my bills by teaching people various, you know, how to manipulate the legal system, how to use legal rules. I'm gonna say to you that, Professor Hakel, the law, it's not going to be through the law. The law, no, I don't. It's the law is not going to be the thing that is going to get us out of our situation. And I think we do have a really problematic situation, you know, with people, you know, training, for instance. You know, I hear this word all the time, training. You know, so, you know, what, I'm going to have somebody tell me, you know, how to think, and you know, that has become actually little by little, because I didn't really, and I got to say, it's partly, you know, I feel partly my fault. I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to, you know, this train. It seems sort of innocuous, but then it sort of creeps up, and it becomes a problem. I don't think that there's a law. And in fact, to the extent that law has been proposed, so one thing we have not talked about, and I think it needs to be talked about, and I think it's a really important issue. On various campuses, when there are free speech student organizations, and for that matter, faculty organizations or any sort of free speech organization. It's a very unfortunate thing, though it's a telling thing, that nowadays when, you know, there's you see a poster, you know, freedom of speech imperiled, let's do something about it. Code conservative. Code conservative. And there's a sort of almost a sort of an allergic reaction from some sectors of the progressive camp. Now, I'm in the progressive camp, okay? I am in the progressive camp. I contribute to The Nation magazine. I write for The American Prospect. I have written for Dissent. I just mentioned those because just, you know, ideologically that I am in the progressive camp, and people in my camp, students and faculty people too, you know, you talk about freedom of expression on campus, they code that conservative. Now, I think that we have a real problem. It has lots of layers to it. One thing I would say to people who are, you know, like your group, Miss Adams, I think that one thing that you need to be very attentive to is you're not being successfully labeled a, you know, a cat's paw for conservative viewpoints masquerading as free speech. And I think that one thing that has to be done on this, so for instance, we had a couple of months ago, I forget who it was in Congress, I forget which senator it was, but there was a senator who proposed some sort of law that would cut off federal financing to institutions that taught, I don't know, or that, you know, use, you know, critical race theory. After, you know, I think that was the term he used. Now, as far as I'm concerned, what you have here is you have a governmental intervention, at least potentially, into the heart of the university system. You're going to be punished for teaching this or that. Now, apart from the substance of what's being talked about, I don't want the state, I don't want the federal government intervening and telling, you know, people at Princeton that they should teach this, they should teach that, they're going to be punished for, you know, not teaching this and that. I want to keep at bay the arm of the state. I think that this struggle is going to have to be waged, and should be waged, as a grassroots campaign of people of intelligence appealing to intelligence. It seems to me that that's the way that this has to be, done. I don't think that the intervention of the law is going to be useful on this.
Let me offer a thought. I mean, one reason why it's so easy to caricature free speech advocacy as being on the right is because on the campuses, the threat to free speech is coming from the left.
Yeah, it has been, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's elemental.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, you agree, I don't have to elaborate.
Now hold it.
Characteristic of the left on the campuses. Now you're talking about a defunct presidential administration's last murmurings. Okay, I'm saying where the threat is actually coming from.
Let me interrupt.
Yep.
I think we need to be very careful here. The United States of America is a huge country. We're talking about thousands of institutions. I think that you're correct with respect to the institutions with which we are most familiar, our institutions. our institutions on this, we're talking about the most elite institutions in the United States. And I think that that's right. I think that unfortunately, and like I said, this is my camp. It really pains me. There was a time, 50 years ago, it was the camp of the progressives that welcomed the sort of the outliers of all sorts. If you were an outlier, that's right, you went to the progressive camp. And unfortunately, and I don't know how this happened, but this has changed. And I view this as a tremendous fumble on the part of progressives, because it seems to me that was part of a great progressive legacy, and things have turned. But I'm simply saying, for students, I would say, be careful. Do not allow yourselves to be typed that way. I think it's very important for people to say, hey, we believe in freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of intelligence.
Excuse me, Randall.
Yeah.
The diversity, inclusion, and belonging blob. Okay, I'm talking about associate provosts, assistant deans, special assistant to the chancellor, special assistant to the president. Okay, I'm talking about propaganda. Okay, I'm talking about re-education. That's what you're saying when you're talking about training. I'm talking about ideologues run amok. How is it that I'm going to criticize that increasingly dug in institutionalization of affirmative action, of racial preferences, without being called a conservative? I mean, that's the least of my concerns. The least of my concerns is what label somebody is going to put. I'm not talking about me, not about a student. Maybe you're giving them good tactical advice. I'm talking about the stakes. The stakes here are on the campuses, on the institutions that we're interested in preserving. The threat is coming from the left. That needs to be recognized.
Again, I think that that's largely true at the most elite institutions.
It's more widespread than that, surely, right? I mean, it's not only the Ivy League where this is a problem. It's all these small liberal arts places. It's the Big Ten schools. It's the big state schools. I can go to if you're talking about the few conservative evangelical, yeah, but that's No,
I'm not talking about. What I'm talking about is I'm simply saying, remember how big this country is. There are places, small places, in which, you do have what I would view as, repression on the right. We need to be attentive to that. As for our campuses, and I want to get back to Professor Hakel, because I heard him, and I don't want to diminish the power of what he was saying. And this is also with Glenn. I think it is true that there are ways of thinking and expectations and demands that have become routinized, regularized. They are put under a certain rubric. And, it's sort of course, all good thinking people believe that.
Randall, I know I'm interrupting you, man, but I remember reading your essays about critical race theory in the 1980s.
Yeah.
I remember you taking on this cadre of scholars in the law schools and raising deep questions about the intellectual probity, about the moral sure-footedness, about the...
I still do.
Well, this is what they have wrought. We now reap the fruit of what they have wrought. Now you're going to tell me that there's a kind of, on the one hand, on the other hand?
No.
It has a genealogy. It has a genealogy, Randall.
It does. So, for instance, earlier when I talked about the creation or the establishment of racial / cultural / gender fences in our culture, that is part of what was wrought. So, you can't talk about this subject. You can't have an opinion about this subject. You can't say this. Well, why? Because you're not, and you fill in the blank. That is part of what I argued against a long time ago. That is part of what's on our campuses. We need to be very much against it.
Identity politics has given birth to identity pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. And we need to fight it.
Has given birth to identity epistemology.
Yes. Yes. In fact,
that's the beginning of the end.
Well, you're now, the beginning of the end. I don't think it has to be the end. I think, in fact, the article that I was thinking about made reference to, I did not know about your term identity epistemology, but the article I read was talking about some documentary filmmaker being criticized. The appropriation. This has gone, are you kidding me? This whole appropriation thing. And here's where, again, I'm self-critical on this, because I remember, a long time ago when this stuff came up. And frankly, I thought, I don't need to say anything about this. This will surely just, wilt of its own. I don't need to push it. It'll, of course, just fall away. It has not fallen away. It's become bigger and bigger and bigger. And, appropriation, I think, what appropriation? Misappropriation. So does this mean that, African Americans in America, in the United States, who view themselves as Christians, are they engaged in misappropriation? Is Louis Armstrong, the greatest trumpeter who ever lived, is he engaging in misappropriation? I mean, what are we talking about? Yet this has grown, and all I've got to say is we've got to engage in a full-out struggle against it. I don't think it's too late, though. And here's where I guess I might, I don't know. I think that it's a problem. It's, we've had problems in academia before. This is a problem. It's a big problem, and I would, it's gonna call for immediate and very strong pushback. But I think that, I think that it's remediable. Let me put it like that.
So I don't know if Professor Lindragon here, but I do want to move on to Taylor, and then we probably have to wrap up soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, so first I'd like to thank you guys for coming and talking to us. It's a privilege for us. And yeah, so I have a question. And I don't expect you to answer it kind of like as a historian kind of thing. It blows my mind that so like it was my understanding growing up and going through middle school, high school, that kind of thing, that a university was the place that you sought to find truth, and that a university was like where you went, and like where you in a high school classroom maybe you just sat down and read a book. At a university you really had discussion, and it seemed to me as a student at Princeton, and also knowing many other college students that have gone to colleges all over the US, that it really isn't the case. I don't, basically, like, how does this happen? How has it happened that, the place where where discussion and different ideas is, that kind of thing is supposed to prevail and be the entirety of the reason you're there. It's like, I mean, just about the closest thing to a polar opposite as I could imagine. I mean, how does something like that happen? And how do we get past that?
Mr. Aiken, I'm glad that you are, upset about it and are aware of it. And I hope that you will devote efforts to changing that situation. I will say, you should know though, this is not altogether new. I went to Princeton I was at Princeton between 1973 and 1977. I'm part of the great class of 77. And you Princetonians will know, that's a familiar thing, the great class of this or that. Well, I'm great class of 77. In my first year at Princeton, I took a course on Southern history. It was taught by Sheldon. It was taught by Sheldon Hackney. And in the middle of that course, there was an uproar. Why? Because Sheldon Hackney gave, as part of the syllabus, he assigned the novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron. And I had colleagues who, there was a protest about it. There was a protest, there was a this, there was a that. And, I think people, I mean, really, it was a big deal. And I remember at the time, what's the big deal? We read the novel, talk about, did you like the novel? Did you not like the novel? What's the big deal? And in any event, there was a big protest about it. And I remember writing a paper about the protest and saying, this is ridiculous. The idea that that it was somehow wrong for the professor to assign a novel. If you don't like the novel, say why you don't like the novel. But the idea that you wouldn't, that it was wrong for the professor to put the novel in the syllabus, it seemed to me just wrong. And I would say that, by the way, if we were talking about William Styron's The Confessions of Nat Turner, I would say that the same if somebody put the novel The Klansman in the syllabus, or had people watch, Birth of a Nation, for goodness sakes. As far as I'm concerned, it would make a lot of sense. If I was teaching a course on Reconstruction, or for that matter, modern American history, I could easily understand, putting, watch Birth of a Nation, let's talk about it, and, what it's about, and, the history of it, and blah, blah, blah. I don't think, So in any event, my point was, this is not, similarly, by the way, when I was in law school, I remember in my first year of law school, in con law, I remember I went to Yale Law School. And I remember in con law, there being a discussion in which students said, now listen, when the POCC opinion is discussed, it was the affirmative action case. When the affirmative action issue is discussed, if the teacher talks about this as if it was open for discussion, we should all get up en masse and leave, because our being here should not be open to discussion. And I remember saying, whoa, 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 hold it now, hold it. We're talking about a case, and then, I was new. I said, we're talking about a case. Let me ask you this. What happens a couple of years from now if you're the lawyer in the case? I mean, you're not going to be able to just sort of say, well, I don't want to discuss this. I mean, presumably you're going to have to represent somebody and, come up with an argument. So, I mean, this does not see, my point is, this you know, has been a long time coming. And, you know, all I can say is I think that we do have, I think it is especially acute in certain ways now. But, you know, listen, there's going to be, you know, there's always been a fight, I suppose, against expression. There's always been a fight against openness. There's always been a fight against the effort to learn. And so I guess we, you know, we ought not be utopian about this. And to a certain extent, we should probably expect forces that are going to want to, you know, shut people up or make people think a certain sort of way. That's, you know, that's part of the, you know, it's part of it. And we should just gird ourselves to fight against those forces.
Let me say this to Taylor Aiken, because your question or comment is poignant. Here's a young mind who had a certain expectation about what this marvelous privilege of 4 years of reflection and study is supposed to yield. And he comes and finds himself disappointed. Don't give up. Keep looking for colleagues of your peers to commiserate with, and for professors like your humble servant here to develop relationships with. Go in the office, close the door, and say what you think, and keep your mind open to what it is that somebody has to say to you. That's happening, notwithstanding all of these cancel culture things. That's happening at Brown's campus between me and my students. I'm sure it's happening at the Harvard Law School, and I'm sure it's happening at Princeton University as well. So just keep looking.
Can I just say, jump in? I agree with everything that Professor Loury said. I'd also say this, Mr. Aiken. If you know, so let's imagine the following happens. You're talking with a colleague, you're talking with one of your classmates, and let's suppose you ask your classmate a question. And, you know, let's suppose, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to say you, I'm going to, you know, student X turns to a classmate and says to the classmate, I'd like to know about such and such. I know where you're from. I don't really know much about, you know, where you're from or the experience you just talked about, but I got a question for you. And you ask the question. And let's imagine that this student looks at you and says, how dare you ask me such a question? That's very insensitive, or something of that nature. It seems to me that the proper response is not for you to run and, you know, it seems to me the proper response is for you to say, excuse me, I can just, number one, I meant you no harm. Number two, I thought we were at a university at which much of the learning was between peers. After all, when people talk about inclusiveness and diversity and all of that, that's what I suppose people had in mind. You know, the kid from Iowa telling the kid from Brooklyn about cows, and the kid from Brooklyn telling the kid from Iowa about whatever's happening in Brooklyn. I mean, that's how we learn stuff. Now, if you don't, you know, that's what I had in mind. I thought that, you know, I thought that maybe I could learn, but, you know, if you don't want to go there, I understand, but I do want you to understand where I was coming from. I think that you have to be willing to do that. I really do. Now, if upon your saying that the person, you know, storms off, well, okay, they've stormed off, you've done your part, and, you know, that's, you know, tough luck. It might be, however, that the person, upon hearing you, maybe they'll be a jackass. That happens. On the other hand, it's also possible that the person will say something else and that you will get in a discussion. And I think that you have to be willing to push a little bit to, you know, sort of make that happen. I don't think that people should be, you know, I think that, you know, again, you've got to, you know, there's going to be a certain amount of pushing and pulling, but I think you have to be willing to put yourself out there at least that much.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we had to wrap up this event, but thank you all for coming out today. I hope you learned a lot. I definitely learned a lot. I first also want to thank Professor Kennedy and Professor Loury for taking time to speak with us today and having this wonderful discussion. And also feel free to check out our Facebook page, POCC, for more events. And I do want to give a special thanks for Tyler for helping me coordinate this event. So it took a lot of work. So yeah, have a good Dean's Day preparation reading week, and you know, stay well.
Thank you, Ms. Adams.
Yeah.
Keep on pushing.
Bye, everyone. Nice being with you.